Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, college football week 11 or so, I think. We get the first college football playoff rankings revealed, but it's not going to be a topic for discussion on this program with so much ground to cover on today's show. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my college football colleagues around these parts, Brad Powers and Payne Insider. And gentlemen, I thought when the season started, we looked at the schedule, we were going to have a Bet the Board road trip around this weekend. Alas, that was canceled, and a game that we're not even going to break down on this show, given the state of one of those programs.
Yeah, and I was kind of the one that poo-pooed it in the summer, so I maybe there's some regrets there. Not really, though. That particular place, that place on a Saturday night in November, not kind to the thin blood that we all have.
No, we have definitely thinned things out over the years for sure. Payne, we don't need any comment on that. We can let our listeners read between the tea leaves because we do have 5 big games to break down with a lot of elimination scenarios on the line, especially in the SEC. But that's not where we're going to kick things off. We'll head to Lubbock for Big Noon kickoff, where it is the Colorado Buffaloes, fresh off a bye, laying a shade more than a field goal, 3.5 painted across the board against Texas Tech. Total on the game up a touch from where it opened at 62 and 63 or 62.5. And as far as this game is concerned, a unique little storyline, Payne, that'll warm your heart. The Red Raiders are going to wear their Patrick Mahomes strategy uniform for the first time in program history. So number 15 will be well represented on the uniform combinations there for the Red Raiders in the wake of a huge upset win, kind of upsetting the apple cart in the Big 12. It was Texas Tech going on the road to Ames and is nearly a 2-touchdown underdog, upsetting Iowa State, knocking them from the ranks of the unbeaten. We do have a little bit of coaching familiarity in this matchup. Head coach at Texas Tech, Joey McGuire, previously coached Deion Sanders Jr. when he was the head coach at Cedar Hill High School in Dallas-Fort Worth. A lot of familiarity between these two first families in college football coaching. Colorado, meanwhile, 6 wins for the first time since they finished 10-4 back in 2016. Colorado has more wins, 6-2, than its previous 2 seasons combined at 5-19. Deion, he can become the first Colorado head coach to win 11-plus games in his first 2 seasons since Rick Neuheisel back in the 90s. We know about all the Travis Hunter hype as well. The propaganda machine out in full force with him doing an interview last week on College Game Day. Meanwhile, Texas Tech, 6-3, best 9-game stretch since 2013 when they started 7-2. Chance to make history, or did, I should say, last week. It was the first win versus an AP Top 10 team since 2012 when they knocked off number 5 West Virginia, and the first road win versus an AP Top 10 team since 2011 when they knocked off Oklahoma. Brad, Texas Tech offensively, we know that's the strength of this team. They have a tremendous running back that doesn't get enough buzz for what he means to the program in Taj Brooks, a quarterback in Baron Morton that when he's healthy can be a dynamic pivot in terms of spreading the ball around to a trio of Tech wide receivers that may not be cut from the same Wes Welker cloth, but Josh Kelly doing outstanding work against the Colorado defense under Robert Livingston's leadership that had a surprising stat for me when we see the adjustments that Colorado has made. They're top 10 in the country when it comes to points allowed after halftime, allowing less than a touchdown per game. The teams that are better than them, Ohio State, Penn State, Texas, Notre Dame, Ole Miss, Oregon, and Indiana. Pretty impressive company to keep. But Texas Tech, fresh off the upset offensively against Colorado, having 2 weeks to prep for an underrated home field advantage in Lubbock.
Going to give the edge to Texas Tech's offense, although I don't think it's a significant one because, and we'll get into it, the improvements that I've seen from Colorado defensively this year that's, in my opinion, not getting enough publicity. But starting with Texas Tech's offense, boy, there's a little bit of inefficiency when you dive into some of their numbers. Number 72 in offensive success rate, number 67 in yards per play. But one thing they do well, and it's the most important stat, they score. They're number 20 in the country in scoring, and they do move the football. And then number 22 in yards per game. Had some turnover issues early in the game, particularly the Washington State game. You mentioned the one guy that's one of the more underrated running backs in the entire country, Taj Brooks. I mean, he's already topped 1,000 yards. Incredibly, it's going to be the 4th straight season he's going to lead this team in rushing. I find it interesting that every time I read a game recap on Texas Tech, the opposing coaches are always mentioning Taj Brooks is one of the better players in the Big 12. So a kid that doesn't get enough credit. Morton obviously has not been 100% not only this year but last year. When he is, I mean, obviously he's a very capable quarterback. He's not going to wow you with arm strength or anything, but he's protected the football more than anything this year, only 5 picks. He's got a couple of, more than capable wide receivers. Josh Kelly, the transfer, Caleb Douglas, another transfer, Eakin at wide receiver. So 3 capable guys there. The worry that I would have is that offensive line's been a little leaky in pass pro the last few weeks. They've given, only 4 sacks allowed the first 5 games of the season, now 9 the last 4, and you're facing a Colorado defense that's, ramped it up as far as them getting after the quarterback here in recent weeks. 17 sacks the last 4 games. It's a Colorado defense that, has knocked nearly 2 touchdowns off their, scoring average from a year ago, nearly 100 yards per game, allowing less than a year ago. So it wasn't a big name as far as the new DC, but so far so good there. Basic counting stats aren't great, 62 in yards per play, 64 in total defense, but, a little bit better than that in defensive success rate. EPA per dropbacks, number 26 in the country. They have a number 27 coverage grade, obviously led by Travis Hunter, who, continues to defy logic as far as the ability to play at a high level, playing on both offense and defense. He's their number 2 graded player on offense with 451 snaps. Defensively, he's their highest graded player with 430 snaps on that side of the ball. Deservedly one of the Heisman favorites for the way he's played. Lola and BJ Green, as far as the top pass rushers for them, again, transfers and no surprise there. Other than that, they don't have, outside of Hunter, they don't have a lot of wow guys. They don't make a ton of wow plays, but one thing they've kept scoring relatively down compared to where they were again a year ago. And that'll be to me, the major matchup to look out here is, can the Colorado pass rush get after Morton, who again has not been healthy? If they can get after and attack him and disrupt it a little bit, then there's at least a pathway here for Colorado to make enough stops to have their offense have a success and them come away with a road win here.
It's amazing. Colorado's outlook within the conference improves, and they don't even play a game last weekend. They get the dominoes to fall perfectly for them. Texas Tech upsets Iowa State. Kansas State goes down as a double-digit favorite at Houston, and here the Buffaloes are seeing their odds continue to shorten to win the Big 12. And Payne, if we're optimistic about Colorado coming into the year, or if there was optimism, it was because of what this team brought to the table offensively. And we've seen their passing attack operate at a very high level. It's top 10 in that particular regard. Shedeur Sanders has offered a few praise towards his relationship with Pat Shurmur, that the two of them see things the same way as far as breaking down film and the adjustments they're making. In-game, Colorado hasn't been able to run the football. No shock to anyone, but you don't have to when you have players like Travis Hunter and LeJontay Wester that are out there creating in space, looking to try and land the explosives. And against the Texas Tech defense that put together an uncharacteristically good performance last week against Iowa State and their ability to generate a pass rush, that unfortunately for the Red Raiders hasn't been the norm, because the defense, when you look at the counting stats and the underlying metrics, has looked a lot more like a sieve than anything else.
Yeah, they showed better last week in certain areas, preventing points being one of them. I think, to your point, is the interesting matchup here. We expected Texas Tech's defense to be a little bit better this year. They've dealt with some injuries. The pressure's been inconsistent, and Colorado's offensive line has certainly made strides this season. It's still not good, but it's improved. Run game isn't good, but it's been efficient enough down to down where defenders and coverage can't cheat and always have their first step back to defend the pass. Pass rushers have to be responsible for run fits and can't always pin their ears back and get after Sanders. And so Colorado's offensive line and run game has been competent enough to where I mean, Pat Shurmur has been able to open up the playbook, and that's why we've seen this offense trend up as the season's gone on. As a whole, though, Texas Tech's defense has been pretty porous, creating havoc up front outside the top 100 in defensive line havoc, even with last week incorporated, outside the top 90 in passing down sack rate. Sanders, I would think, should be relatively clean here. And going back to last week, it's not like Iowa State didn't move the football. 7 trips inside the green zone. But to your point, like how Tech pulled off the upset is only allowing an average of 2 points per trip. They hunkered down there in the green zone quite well. But I think the lack of havoc and pressure Tech creates up front could spell some trouble here. The Red Raiders secondary outside our top 80 in both schedule-adjusted passing success rate and EPA per pass allowed. They've struggled giving up chunk throws. On the season, Tech's allowed the most 15-plus yard passes in the country. Shedeur Sanders on chunk throws, 10-plus yards. He's got 20 big-time throws to just 3 turnover-worthy plays. If you read what's coming out of Colorado, the bye week has done wonders for mostly every key cog in that receiver group. Hunter, Wester, Horn, we're all kind of playing through some nagging little injuries. I don't know at this exact moment who's in or out for the Red Raider defense, but their injury report on defense was mirrored Schindler's List this week. It was quite long. So if Colorado's going to go out on the road and cover 3.5, it's because they kept Sanders clean, torched this Texas Tech secondary. No, you and I talked, Todd, a little bit earlier in the week about the potential wind factor here and maybe that negating some of Colorado's offensive success through the air. Right now, as we record this Wednesday morning, and it's always good to keep an eye on this as we get closer to kickoff, but steady winds basically between like 5 and 9 miles per hour, gusts into the mid to high teens. So it's starting to trend down relative to where it was earlier this week.
BP, last word to you on this game. How much of an adjustment do you make to Texas Tech in the wake of their upset victory last weekend against Iowa State when they put together a complete contest, but Payne kind of mentioned that they were rather fortunate with their ability to bend but not break against the Cyclones? And in terms of where you'd forecast this market to have been had they lost that game rather than putting together that 12-play, 70-plus yard march that took under 2 minutes to get them the outright win?
Yeah, I was a little conservative. A double-digit outright upset, you think a couple points. I only upgraded them a point. Boy, if they don't score there late and don't get that touchdown, I think we're looking at 4.5 here at least. So, opportunity, and that also impacted Iowa State's game this week, where that final score I think hurt us as far as the ability to really attack a couple of underdogs this week.
Yeah, 2 bets.
Takes a little value away from 2 prospective home underdogs for sure that would have been in the radar under normal circumstances, to say the least. Home underdogs, though, we have a couple of them in the SEC, and the early kickoff is in lovely Oxford, Mississippi, where it's Ole Miss playing host to the Georgia Bulldogs. And Georgia finds themselves a 2.5-point road favorite. There are some threes if you happen to like the underdog in this game. Total more or less 55 painted across the board. 48th meeting between these SEC programs. Georgia visiting Oxford for the first time since they lost here 45-14 back in 2016. That was actually the largest loss and remains the largest loss for Georgia under Kirby Smart's leadership. Last year, well, Georgia got a little bit of revenge in that particular regard, had the largest margin of victory in the series since Georgia won 42-3 at home back in 1978 with a 35-point win. Georgia 51-14 in that football game. Georgia needed a late second half surge to get by Florida, outscored the Gators 28-7 once UF had to go to their backup quarterback, with DJ Lagway missing the remainder of that contest. Georgia, meanwhile, has won 52 straight games versus non-Alabama teams, 1-3 versus Alabama in that span. They've also won 15 straight games in November, dealing with a rash of injuries that I know you guys will get to on both sides of the ball. Meanwhile, for Ole Miss, they can match the highest AP ranked win in school history when they knocked off Alabama, who was sitting at number 2 back in 2015. Pair of losses this season for the Rebels, both came by a field goal, and it feels like a de facto elimination game given where the Rebels were seated in the inaugural unveiling of the college football playoff rankings. But Ole Miss comes in riding a wave, tied for the most points in an SEC game in school history, much to our chagrin, with a 63-point outburst last week against Arkansas. And BP, Ole Miss, by the numbers, 42-plus points per game this season, fourth in the FBS. A point-per-game differential, plus 28.9, second behind only Indiana. It's the second-best point-per-game differential through 9 games in school history. But we hadn't seen some of the big play potential from Ole Miss offensively until Arkansas secondary entered the chat. Jackson Dart and a running game loses a key cog in Henry Parrish. We're not sure about the availability of Trey Harris, so I imagine we'll try and go in this spot. But Ole Miss offensively against the Georgia defense that we've only seen one great data point. It was pretty impressive under the lights in Austin against Texas. They just haven't been able to perform at that high level that we've grown accustomed to with Kirby at the helm, game in and game out so far this season.
Yeah, this is a complicated one because basic counting stats, if you just had, I didn't know the names of these teams and was just looking at the statistical data, I would say edge to Ole Miss here. But, there's a variety of moving factors here. Number one, injuries on both teams, but, consistency or lack thereof of performance from both. I guess all it took for Ole Miss's offense to wake up, which had been struggling. 55 points per game, non-conference, 24 points per game in conference prior to last week. All it took for them to wake up, obviously, was us to bet the under in an Ole Miss game. And, whoa, lo and behold, we get the Ole Miss offense from September.
And we even got the goal line stop early in the game. Had us feeling good when we get the situation unfold. Then Taylon Green happened, and the rest was complete unadulterated misery.
What we did see was Dart obviously have, an historical game as far as Ole Miss is concerned. Throws for 516 yards, 6 touchdowns, highest graded quarterback in the country last week on big-time throws, throwing it down the field, taking shots. He's 5 out of 6, 282 yards, 3 touchdowns on 25-yard-plus throws. Obviously, Trey Harris, at one time, led the nation in receiving. He didn't play for the second week in a row. So here we go. Jordan Watkins. What's he do? He has a school record 252 yards, school record 5 touchdown receptions in that game. Caden Lee had over 100 yards. They continue to work the tight ends. You got Wells for the season averaging over 20 yards per catch. So there's still plenty of weapons here to be had. I agree with you. My anticipation is Harris plays this week or tries to give it a go. Parrish not, being on the depth chart's pretty concerning. Their leading rusher. And I can tell you this, for a team that's number 1 in the country in yards per play, number 2 in total offense, and you go in the advanced metrics, number 5 in success rate, number 4 in EPA dropback, offensive line still is the concern here. And why I'm not willing to give them a significant edge here is I do think Georgia has the edge up front, because you look at this Ole Miss offensive line, who we thought was going to be an issue coming into the season. There's kind of a mismatch of guys coming back, and they welcomed in several transfers that they expected to play. The 2 losses, Kentucky got after them, 4 sacks. LSU was able to get after them, 6 sacks for the season, a number 73 run blocking grade, a 75 pass blocking grade. And if you move to the other side of the ball, what are we going to get from Georgia? You would hope that if you're a Georgia backer, you're going to get what Kirby dialed up against Texas. Obviously, we talked about it, 7 sacks, the most in any game for them in 3.5 seasons. They refused to dial it up in the other games this season. It's a Georgia defense that's not going to be confused with the 21 and 22 historically great defenses, but obviously, they've shown that when they play their A game, that they can be still one of the top defenses in the country, and that coming from the edge in Jalen Walker and Michael Williams. Michael Williams, in particular, hasn't been healthy this season. We'll see if he gets increased snaps. I hate to do this to Payne, but man, KJ Bolden is. If you look at minimum 50% snaps, he's their highest graded defender as a true freshman. It shows, and again, I mentioned this several times. I go back to SEC media days. If Kirby and Saban were talking together, it's like they were ignoring everybody else on the set. But Kirby said that Saban asked him who's the guy that needs to step up and play a lot of snaps for you, young guy, and play well. And Kirby mentioned it was KJ Bolden, and obviously that's come to fruition. We'll see if they can get a linebacker back and Mondone, who's missed a couple of games now. But to me, it just all comes down to whether Kirby wants to dial it up or not and get some pressure. If he does and is aggressive, then there's certainly opportunity for, obviously Georgia to kind of almost have their way here, similar to what Kentucky and LSU did. If they're conservative, and you give Dart time. I mean, they've proven with Harris or without him. I mean, he's capable of beating you. But I'll say another thing. Lane hasn't been the best in these big games the last few years. I don't know if he goes a little conservative or what, but I haven't seen an A game from him against an Alabama or Georgia or hell on the road against LSU. They move the football, but they're not consistent, and particularly in short yardage situations.
You took me where I wanted to go, Brad, before we got to Payne to address the Georgia offense against the Ole Miss defense. And Payne, you can piggyback, whatever Brad has to say on this particular topic, but in terms of quantifying the impact of a head coach, I'm not going to say it's apples to apples, but we saw a similar situation unfold last weekend, and a lot of people that were advocating for Ohio State said, quite frankly, they didn't trust James Franklin to go out there and make the right calls, to play aggressively enough to win a game of that magnitude, and that was more or less what unfolded in Beaver Stadium. I'm not saying that's going to happen again in Oxford this week, but Kirby has the pedigree. He's shown an ability to beat all of these coaches. Meanwhile, Lane still needs to try and find a way to climb the mountain, even if he's got the more talented team. And, all things being equal, there's a lot more pressure on Ole Miss here. They have no margin for error. You lose and the season's over.
Well, I think it's getting a little bit reflected in the market, the lack of trust for Kiffin here. Because, again, if you remove the names and just look at the data, the statistical data, and then factoring that Ole Miss is at home, you can make a case that Ole Miss should be maybe laying a point or two here. But because of what we've seen in big-time games, no surprise that the Georgia's the short favorite here. And, I will say we did take advantage of anything above 3 was gobbled up a little bit, though. So there's edges to be had here. We'll just see if Lane can finally come through.
Payne, Lane has his fingerprints all over the Ole Miss offense, but defensively, this is a Rebels team that has been extremely stout in the trenches. Given the amount of money and resources they allocated to bolstering that defensive line, it was a point of emphasis for this group all offseason, and thus far it's paid dividends. Now matched up against a Georgia offense that hasn't been able to run the football consistently, extremely banged up at the running back position, and you look at Carson Beck, who's become a walking, talking turnover. 11 interceptions, the most by a Georgia quarterback since Aaron Murray had 14 back in 2011. 10 touchdown passes to 11 picks over the last 5 games after he had a clean sheet to start the season with 7 touchdowns and no picks the first 3 games of the season. Does it fall on Beck? Does it fall on the offensive line? Or has it been their inability to create balance, and in known passing situations, it just hasn't worked out the way the Bulldogs have drawn it up?
Both of you boys today are firing. Both are picking at the wound a little bit here. Not just KJ Bolden, who is having quite the season for the old dogs. I was just looking at this 2.8 yards per target allowed. I think not just me, but the rest of the country, unfortunately, did not get to see Jeremiah Smith and Travis Hunter play together in recruiting matters. And I think some staff changes coming at Florida State quite quickly here. But when we speak about recruiting, this is the exact matchup that had Ole Miss boosters in the NIL collective going out on a spending spree this offseason. Ole Miss wanted to compete at this level with Georgia and the teams like that in the college football world. And to do that, you need to bulk up in the trenches. And so for me, this side of the matchup is pretty simple. Who wins, right? Georgia's offensive line or the Rebels' defensive line. Georgia got a very nice piece back along the O-line in Tate Ratledge last week. Obviously, reports coming out that he's quite sore after that game, having not played in well over a month. That group actually held the fort down better than people think without Ratledge in terms of pass protection, just a 21% pressure rate allowed. There was just zero push in the ground game. Georgia right now outside the top 100 in offensive line yards created, and I'm not sure one man completely solves that issue, especially this week. The Rebels' defensive line, top 3 in every single meaningful rushing metric. Success rate allowed, EPA per rush rate allowed. Number 1 in yards per rush allowed before first contact. So nobody has been able to consistently run on Ole Miss. Trevor Etienne appears like he's going to be able to go, but got dinged up a little bit in the Florida game last week. Georgia, everything I am hearing, wants to control this game with tempo, with pace and feel. They want this to be a Kentucky Ole Miss style game. If they can do that, it certainly is a little bit more conducive to them having success. And I think if Ole Miss can stop Georgia's ground game, it becomes pretty difficult. And it's now all on Carson Beck, and I think, Todd, you hit it perfectly. That's been a scary proposition of late. 12 turnover-worthy plays the last 5 games, and it's all about pressure. I went back and listened to our Georgia preseason preview, and we discussed Carson Beck. Very simple. Keep him clean. Allow him to set his feet. He's damn good. But you get Beck off his spot and force him to reset his feet, it's game over. And the larger sample size data continues to prove that. 25% dip in adjusted accuracy when Carson Beck is pressured. He goes from a top 25 quarterback to outside the top 110 when he's under pressure. Ole Miss leads the nation in pressures, number 2 in sacks. That front is ferocious. Top 10 in havoc rate and passing down sack rate. But if you can keep your quarterback upright against Ole Miss, there are some plays to be had a little bit downfield. They do give up the explosive. We even saw that last week against Arkansas a little bit, where that intermediate stuff can be available. I think Brad hit it perfectly, though. It is Lane Kiffin and his offense against Kirby Smart's defense, and that matchup along that line of scrimmage, it keeps me on the sideline here, especially at the current market price.
That's what we figured. 3 made a ton of sense in terms of some of the value seekers that they're out there now as we sit in no man's land. It'll be interesting to see where the next move goes. Go ahead, Payne.
What did you get there, Brad? You get over the 3?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I figured. Yeah,
life would be great if I could give out widely available numbers at the numbers I get. It would be easy. Wouldn't have to work that much.
Be a little more straightforward at that particular juncture when some of those prices were available. Totals remain largely unchanged at 55.
Where do you think it goes? Biggest game of the week. Do you think do we come back to widely available 3? There's a few 3s out there. I actually think we're going to close under.
Yeah, I think
the number.
I think the number's right where it should be.
Yeah.
All right.
I think we're kind of here.
I think it's right there, and I think you'll get...
Now, if somehow another wave comes in on Ole Miss, there's going to be a battle because there's going to be guys laying pick with Georgia.
Early indications, too, for this game. Looks like good two-way action at the price as well. So it's not like the books find themselves creating a ton of liability as the way things sit right now. So we shall see how...
Agreed. Yep.
Yeah, and again, may take on a very similar tenor. I have to imagine bookmakers would love this game to fall 1 or 2 if the number sits at 2.5.
Yeah.
With the general public looking to lay 2.5 with Georgia and back Ole Miss on the money line because we know points never matter, especially 1 and 2 in the college game, right? South Carolina and Vanderbilt. A little bit of an under-the-radar game in the SEC that'll probably not be watched by nearly as many folks, going on in roughly the same time window as the aforementioned Georgia and Ole Miss matchup. South Carolina, 3.5-point road favorites for their trip into Nashville to take on an overachieving Commodore side. Total on this game, 46.5. 34th meeting between South Carolina and Ole Miss. South Carolina, a resounding 29 wins and 4 losses. They beat the Vanderbilt Commodores 47-6 last year. It was the largest margin of victory in the series. South Carolina's won 15 straight meetings. Vanderbilt's last win came back in 2008. South Carolina has knocked off Vandy 7 straight in Nashville. Teams have met every season since 1992 when they played in the SEC East. First meeting, though, ever between these two programs where Vanderbilt actually comes in as a ranked team. It'll also mark the first time, depending on what you use as the closing line against Oklahoma, that South Carolina will be favored this year in a conference game. Meanwhile, for Vandy, found a way to defeat Alabama and Auburn in the same season for the first time since 1955, seeking to win their 4 conference games in a season for the first time since 2013. And Clark Lee, pretty outspoken in terms of saying what he had to do to change up the practice approach for all of the players that are a little bit banged up. We know Vanderbilt not nearly as deep as some of the perennial powers in the conference, and that was on full display with Diego Pavia kind of limping around the field en route to a 9 for 22 performance in an outright upset of Auburn. But Brad, offensively for Vandy, I mean, one of their strengths has been a time of possession that's the highest in the SEC. They've held onto the football for more than 32 minutes per game. They've leaned into Pavia's elusiveness to try and dodge sacks for an offensive line that doesn't have the same building blocks as an LSU or some of the power programs. They're banged up in the backfield. Eli Stowers was in concussion protocol. All signs point to him being able to go, though. Against the South Carolina defense that we've talked about at great lengths, you identified them early in the year, got us a rocking chair winner last week with South Carolina as a home underdog against A&M, and a defensive line that Vandy hasn't seen so far in conference play.
Yeah, I mean, you got to give the edge to South Carolina's defense here. The question is, how big can this edge be? And I think it's dependent on, number one, Diego Pavia's health. He's certainly not 100%, but, how close to 100% is he? Because it did not look great last week, even though they got the outright upset win over Auburn. I think it was more bad Auburn than great Vanderbilt last week. Also looked like the running back, Alexander, didn't look 100% in that game. And I think the other factor here is obviously Vanderbilt. I mean, the basic counting stats on offense say this isn't a good offense. I mean, number 94th in yards per play, number 107 in total offense. But you mentioned it, that they're able to sustain drives, that they play a very slow tempo. And obviously it works when you're catching points when like they are this week. And a big reason why they're, 6-0 against the spread, catching points this season. The other thing is, you got to be disciplined on defense when playing them. And boy, as talented as South Carolina is, and they are super talented. I would, when you look at their defense, I would put it maybe top 5 in the country in terms of talent. They are not always consistent, and sometimes I question the coaching for South Carolina as a whole. So can they stay disciplined on a down and down out basis? Because there's opportunities for this South Carolina defensive line to eat. Because if there's a weakness on Vanderbilt's offense, it is that offensive line, their inability to pass block. They got a number 118 in the country pass blocking grade. They don't do much better in the run blocking, either 108th in the country. Stowers is a nice weapon at tight end. They really don't have a great wide receiver. Sherrill's come on a little bit as far as being maybe their deep threat, but last week was their worst performance offensively this season. They only had 227 yards. They couldn't run the football. Obviously, when Pavia's limping around, he opens up the rest of the ground game, and when he can't do it, I mean, obviously he didn't even hit 100 yards last week, and he wasn't able to really throw it. He had his worst passing game of the season. So, boy, and I also, they got that all-important 6th win. Hay in the barn, are you continuing to keep that edge this week? I got to question it. I also got to question South Carolina's ability to see if they have an edge, because they played their best game of the season last week. Home run spot for them. You look at, you start up front with them, as good of a defensive line, in my opinion, in the country, at least at getting after the passer, number 2 pass rush grade in the country. Dylan Stewart, the 5-star freshman, has lived up to the billing and then some. Third highest pass rush grade in the country this season. He had the 2nd highest last week, so he's not hit that freshman wall. TJ Sanders at defensive tackle was the highest graded defensive tackle in the country last week. Kyle Kennard has 8.5 sacks. They come with waves of different players. They're old, experienced players outside of Stewart. I think the broadcast last week said on South Carolina's team they have 37 4th, 5th, and 6th-year seniors, so they look like a grown man type of team. The back end's been good, number 2 coverage grade, number 11 in EPA dropback. They got dudes at every level, and if they're dialed in and locked in, and Vanderbilt's not healthy here, number seems a little short, and there's a reason why I already filled some orders on South Carolina this week.
Payne, Vandy's success this year has come in this underdog role where they're undefeated. They've struggled when they've been forced to lay points against the likes of Georgia State and Ball State, losing outright to Georgia State and never flirting going outside the number as nearly a 4-touchdown favorite. But it hasn't been because of what this group can do defensively from a counting stats standpoint. I mean, they are +6 in turnover margin, but when you dig into some of the counting stats, it's a little bit problematic. But I guess the overarching question I have for you, does South Carolina have the offensive capabilities to go out there and exploit a Vandy defense, knowing that Lenoris Sellers, maybe he is rounding into shape coming off of his best game of the season against A&M. Rocket Sanders, a strong performance. And when you assess where South Carolina is at the skill positions, Joshua Simon, massive game last week, but Mazio Bennett a little bit dinged up in that receiving room for the Gamecocks.
Really fun matchup. And that's when we put this on the card, it was like, ooh, this one's kind of fun to talk about. South Carolina trying to take that next step as a program. Vanderbilt has taken that next step, but it started from the basement, and so you have two teams now fairly close to one another. And a lot of it's to do with this side of the ball. You got two improving units. Vanderbilt defensively has made strides as the season's progressed, especially up front. That Vandy front has been surprisingly good. Top 30 in defensive line yards allowed, top 20 in havoc created. South Carolina's offensive line has created more running lanes of late, and man, I thought that was a pretty monumental effort last week. Created nearly 2.4 line yards per rush against an elite A&M front, 48% rushing success rate, nearly a 20% explosive run rate. You mentioned Rocket Sanders. He looks healthier by the week after the labrum surgery in the offseason he had. So to me, this almost comes down to the two weaknesses. Lenore Sellers was fantastic using his legs, avoiding sacks last week because the pressure was there. South Carolina's offensive line still allowing pressures at alarming rates. He was pressured on 16 dropbacks by A&M, 100% sack avoidance, and he completed 6 of 9 passes under pressure. Should have been 7 if not for a drop. 147 passer rating when pressured. So to your point, even though if you just look at like the completion rate, it doesn't look great for Lenore Sellers, but what he was able to do, avoiding sacks, keeping the offense ahead of the down and distance to allow the run game to be more effective in standard downs, was all to do with his legs. And I think that's probably, the accuracy still leaves a little bit to be desired. That has to be better this week. You have to be able to attack Vanderbilt through the air. That is their major weakness outside our top 100 in every meaningful category, from success rate to explosiveness through the air. And I think that's the key, because Sellers probably won't complete 75% of his passes here. That's not who he is right now. But when he does, they have to count. And so I envision Sellers' legs, along with Sanders, keeping the Gamecocks offense in standard downs where it becomes extremely easy to throw on Vandy. Can Lenore Sellers do that? Right? Certainly, again, showed improvement against a very good Mike Elko defense a week ago. I think the recipe is quite simple at this point for South Carolina. It's run the ball, don't turn it over. Sellers did have a great week, not having a single turnover worthy play last week. Continue to avoid the sacks when the inevitable pressure comes, and then, to Brad's point, let the defense eat, because that's one of the most talented defenses in the country, and that's kind of the recipe here for South Carolina to this point in the season and moving forward.
Before we close the book on this game, BP, I want to come back to you real quick. In terms of your assessment of the Gamecocks, from where they were when the season started to how you evaluated them with this many data points under their belt, have you made major adjustments to this group given how well their defense has performed in spurts, or some of the expectations that you've seen either exceeded or haven't exceeded from the offensive side?
Yeah, I got them. They're up to number 15 overall in my power ratings. I've upgraded them 5.5 points since the start of the season. So I've been super impressed. Now, Sellers has to take care of the football. I'd like that to be cleaned up a little bit more, but I thought the defense was going to be good. We certainly heard great practice reports in fall camp, but boy, they've even far exceeded those expectations. They look as good as anybody coming off the bus and once they get going. So I've upgraded them significantly, although not as much as Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt and Indiana are approaching all-time upgrade. That I've never upgraded teams as much as those two teams I have this season.
How much have you moved Vanderbilt since? And I guess that seems a logical place to close this breakdown.
Yeah, 14.5 since the start of the season. And keep in mind, that doesn't even include I had already upgraded them. From last season to start the season. So, we're talking about a team approaching 17 points since the end of last season upgrade. It's unbelievable what they're doing. Jerry Kill and Diego Pavia, and you got to give Clark Lee credit for making those hires and bringing those guys in. But I don't know. I can tell you this. It's going to require me to do some, deep thoughts, whether I'm going to, if I can really handle all this variance and upgrades on these teams, because there's more than a few. I don't want to, I won't take a shot. There's a team, let's just say, as much as I've upgraded teams, there's a couple teams that I've downgraded more than ever before, and Payne's probably familiar with one. I've never had to downgrade a team that much.
It is a wild landscape in college football with plenty of surprises, and Vanderbilt, one of the feel-good stories of the campaign, as you mentioned. Bowl eligible regardless of how the rest of the campaign ends, and still plenty of opportunities to throw a little wrench into the postseason plans for the likes of South Carolina, LSU, and Tennessee along the way. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Follow me on social. But most importantly, for all things Bet the Board related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record since it is week 11, but if you haven't already subscribed to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter, encourage you to go ahead and do so, delivered right to your inbox each and every Friday. Check those spam filters, look in the trash. The props that we've seen in that newsletter have been white hot all season long, and no reason to believe those trends can't continue as we get deeper into the NFL campaign. And last week, Brad, we kind of went away from the little guy, from the non-Powers 5, but this week getting back to our roots, and it's a game where I think a lot of people are going to be interested to watch because it involves an undefeated Service Academy laying 6 points, headed on the road to Denton, Texas to take on North Texas. Total in the game, 63.5. Army last week, a little bit of a surprise personnel change right before kickoff. We see Bryson Daly downgraded to out in that spot. Dwayne Coleman takes over. Under money comes in against Air Force. Dog money comes in as well. Army wins comfortably, but doesn't come anywhere near covering the number late in that contest. The total never gets anywhere. North Texas, 2 weeks to prepare for a unique Army offense, which can only help a defense that struggles for good stretches of games to stop the run and the pass. But what stands out to you in this matchup between an Army team laying nearly a touchdown on the road and a North Texas offense that is more than capable of putting up points in bunches like we've seen already when they've stepped up in class in the AAC?
Yeah, first let me talk price here. I like North Texas here. Right now, best number you can find is +6. Is that going to be the absolute best number you can find all week? There's a possibility, this one ticks up 6.5 or 7. Reading the tea leaves, and that's if Daly gets officially announced in. Right now, market's treating him as probable, which is what the coach says. He's, questionable. He's more probable than questionable. But what am I seeing here is, boy, if he's not 100%, and keep in mind, it was, a foot injury is what we're hearing. And I heard a boot was in place last week. Boy, the last I checked, you need to run the ball at quarterback to run this offense. And even if he's in, I question how effective this Army offense is going to be with him in it. But I will say this. He's one of the more valuable Service Academy quarterbacks we've seen because, Army's offense was pathetic last week without him. They only had 255 yards against Air Force. That's 200 yards less than their season average. So I think he's certainly worth more than 3 points, probably closer 5, maybe even more than that. Another reason why I really like North Texas here, and again, I'm very price sensitive, but I think there's a great ability here for an outright upset is who in the hell has Army played? Overall, number 145 schedule in the country. You look at Sagarin's ratings, which I like looking at because it includes the FCS, but particularly Army's defense has faced a bunch of nobodies. FAU, Rice, Temple, Tulsa, UAB, East Carolina, Air Force. Nobody ranked in the top half of college football on the offensive side of the ball. North Texas, number 3 offense. And again, I don't think they've seen anything like this passing attack that they're going to see, and I think they're going to have to keep pace with the North Texas passing offense, and I question their ability to do that if they have a banged-up quarterback. So you mentioned the bye. It's always great to have a bye with extra time to prep for the option. I think Army's getting expensive in the market. Remember, they covered their first 6 games of the season. They haven't covered their last 2 games. I also think North Texas, maybe a little bit of misleading finals. They're coming in off 2 back-to-back losses, but they outgained both Memphis and Tulane, 2 of the best teams in the American. So add it all up for me, and we'll take North Texas +6. Might not be the best number we see in the market, but I'm not sure you're going to need them. I think I'll call my shot. I think North Texas wins the game outright.
I like it. Go out, go bold, and hope the Mean Green can get things done with a little bit of home field advantage working in their favor. Payne, before we move on to the next game, wasn't sure if you had any thoughts you wanted to add to this contest as well.
Like it a lot.
All right. A few words, short, succinct, and directly to the point.
What he said was, I probably said too much.
No, I think it's the
Brad's learning to speak my language. There you go.
Washington, Penn State, gentlemen. A little bit of Big Ten flavor on a card that lacks some of those inspirational matchups, so to speak. These programs will meet in the regular season for the first time since 1921. It's the annual whiteout game under the lights at Beaver Stadium, which, of course, loses some luster in the wake of Penn State coming up short last weekend against the Ohio State Buckeyes. Meanwhile, for Washington, they continue to be a stat sheet warrior. Team keeps winning the counting stats game, but struggles to convert any of that into offensive efficiency or put together complete results. Last week, it just was the opponent they faced in USC happened to be a little bit more inept in scoring territory than the Washington Huskies. They've kind of been led by their defense this year, which made 2 fourth-quarter red zone stands en route to that 26-21 win over Lincoln Riley and company. For Penn State, they've won 27 straight games versus unranked opponents, fourth longest active streak in the FBS. Last loss coming back on October 2021 versus Illinois in a 9-overtime thriller. Nittany Lions still very much clearly in the playoff hunt. Strength of schedule may leave a lot to be desired, but they finish 11-1. Nobody's keeping them out of the 12-team postseason. Brad, Washington's offense, 20 points in the first half for just the second time this season. Last week against USC. Now, the second half, rather uninspiring. They mustered just 6 and had to hold on for dear life. But there are some weapons to be excited about on Jed Fish's offense. Jonah Coleman in the backfield, Denzel Boston and Giles Jackson providing a nice 1-2 punch. The scary thing for Washington, this group may be 35th in total offense, but they're 112th in red zone scoring percentage and 126 in the country in yards per point, matched up against a Penn State defense that's been good against the run, good against the pass, and while they might not be as great as what we've seen in the past, still no doubt one of the top units in the country from a top 20 standpoint.
Yeah, certainly an edge here to Penn State's defense, and you certainly hit the nail on the head as far as Washington's major issue offensively. It's, they have no problem moving the football between the 20s. And they've even hit some big plays. They're number 30th in the country in yards per play. But when it comes to scoring, whether it's missed field goals, whether it's ill-timed turnovers, ill-timed penalties, they have not been buttoned up in the red zone. And they've also, there's a little bit of when you start looking at some of their data, that there's, it's not straightforward and very consistent. I mean, there's some inconsistency here. I mean, you look at one and you see a number 14th offensive success rate. But then you start diving into, only 46 in EPA per rush. You dive into some of their offensive line issues, and they have some. We thought they'd have a lot of issues on the offensive front coming into the season, and it hasn't looked that good. I mean, you're talking about an offensive line that's number 122 in pass blocking grade, number 98 in run blocking grade. Despite the inability to have good grades there, they got a decent running back in Jonah Coleman who's lived up to his billing, the transfer from Arizona. You look at Will Rogers, he's done fine, completing over 70% of his passes, only 4 interceptions yet. Again, only 62 in QBR and doesn't have that, not even in the top 30 in EPA per drop back. So their inability to finish drives is, left a lot of this, if you're a Washington fan and you're used to the last 2 years with Penix and Kalen DeBoer, it hasn't been the greatest look. And what I worry here, obviously, like I mentioned, is up front, because prior to last week against a banged up, depleted USC defensive line, where they gave up 0 sacks, and Washington knew they had a problem because they actually went with a different lineup on the offensive line. They had significant issues against Michigan, Iowa, and Indiana protecting. 11 sacks combined allowed in those games. And obviously Penn State is not the, almost historically great, at least as far as their standards defense from a year ago, but they're still fully capable of getting after this Washington offensive line, starting with Abdul Carter. Zane Duran on the interior has overperformed this year. I will say, though, a lot of things are disheartening about last week. And people are going to talk about the offensive play calling at the goal line. I think what was as much troubling, and again, this isn't speaking that Washington's going to be able to take advantage, but when you had a banged up Ohio State offensive line, and Ohio State finishes the game 11 plays, 58 yards, 5.5 minutes run off the clock, and all 11 were running plays, and you couldn't stop them. And keep in mind, if you're not familiar with Penn State, very similar thing happened last year at home against Michigan. Michigan doesn't even barely attempt a pass in the second half, and you can't stop it. And that's supposed to be the strength of your team is up front on defense. I don't know. I got problems with that. I don't think Washington's going to take advantage of it, but when it comes to the next big game, for big game James, whether be in the playoffs here, there's some issues that I think better offenses and better offensive lines are going to probably further expose this Penn State defense.
Kind of scary when you look at Penn State, their overall body of work, know how they power rate throughout the market, going to finish most likely 11-1, barring some unforeseen upset on their schedule. The eye test doesn't tell me they're one of the best teams in the country or a legitimate threat to win a national championship when you assess some of the other teams in the Big Ten and, of course, a lot of the big boys in the SEC as well. But that's not what we're trying to figure out here. It's about how Penn State will fare as nearly that 2-touchdown favorite against Washington with a total that sits, in the mid, as I look at it right now, might be nice if I knew exactly where it was, in mid-40s. Payne, offensively for Penn State, first offensive game last weekend, first game without an offensive touchdown last weekend since 2014, snapped a 129-game streak with doing that, 3 points on 3 trips to the red zone, a field goal, interception, a turnover on downs, 2 total yards on 8 offensive plays in the red zone, had first and goal from the 3-yard line twice, come away with 0 points. I mean, the pieces always felt like square peg in a round hole with Andy Kotelnicki and what he was going to be forced to do to bring this offense into the 21st century. For Washington, though, this is a group that's been very good against the pass, but against the run, they leave a little bit to be desired. Maybe this is just what the doctor ordered if Penn State wants to run the football on 80% of their offensive snaps.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tougher conversation because we obviously love Andy Kotelnicki, but I think we've also been first to the idea that this is certainly clunky, and the talent on this side of the ball leaves a lot to be desired. But I think, to your point, this is really straightforward, and maybe Andy needs to see if Washington has any of Jimmy Lake's Run the Damn Ball merch laying around in a closet somewhere in the football facility. Because for me, that's the theme of this game. I mean, Penn State has to run the ball right down Washington's throats. Penn State Insider top 25 in schedule adjusted line yards created. So their offensive line's actually been decent, creating a little bit of push. Washington's defensive line outsider top 85 in line yards allowed. So a nice little matchup edge there. I think you just have to ride the 2 horses if you're Andy and Allen and Singleton. Penn State has been an offense that's top 15 in rushing success rate. Now, what's concerning to me and what I would think and what I would do might be a little bit different than what Baby Belichick is doing. For me, I'm loading the box here, right? But Belichick just hasn't shown a willingness to do that. Indiana ran right down Washington's throat in the second half. Unfortunately, I watched every snap of that. We had a big bet on the adjusted second half line there. Only needed to throw the ball once in the second half, Indiana, right? There's a 3rd and 6 late where it's like, you have a backup quarterback in for Indiana. Why are you playing 6 in the box? You need to dictate and have a young kid throw the ball on 3rd and 6, right? That's your advantage as a defense. Get them in those types of downs. And Belichick did not show a willingness to load the box. I think that has to be what Belichick does here. And if he can do it, then Washington maybe has a chance, right? If Penn State can't run the ball, the path becomes pretty difficult because the strength of Washington are their corners and secondaries, top 5 in the country in EPA per pass surrendered. Literally just led to Miller Moss being benched. The question mark we've had all season and told you about is Penn State's lack of weapons at receiver. Outlined it last week. It proved to be an issue. Ohio State effectively bracketed Tyler Warren, forced Penn State receiver group to win one-on-one outside, and they couldn't do it. Penn State had 3 catches from its wide receivers last week. So metrically, the Washington secondary is better than Ohio State's. It's very straightforward. Belichick has to load the box, force Penn State to do something differently than hand it off to Allen and Singleton. So the path is on the ground. Now, the line is interesting. I think we talk about this all the time, and maybe it's a little bit different for some bettors, but the ability to read the market and digest what a number is telling you, obviously it's not always going to end up right. But this line says it's Penn State or pass.
Yep.
And you do have some variance because the two teams are coming off drastically different results that likely have them in different mental states. Can Penn State pick themselves up off the deck after another big game James loss? A night game whiteout probably eases some of those fears. But then you think about Washington, like, can they refocus after beating a rival and overcome a terrible spot here? And I think this is a terrible spot, right? Since Friday, September 27th, the travel schedule for Washington has been brutal. Travel from Washington to New Jersey to face Rutgers, come back home to take on Michigan, travel to Iowa, come back home, head back out to play Indiana, come back home to face USC, now travel to Pennsylvania to take on Penn State. That's been the schedule the last 6 weeks. So this is a really tough spot for Washington as well here, fellas.
We have the Oregon Ducks travel agent on line too, as well, as I'm sure the Ducks travel schedule, similar to what Washington has had to endure, and it's just the nature of where we are in the new look Big Ten for teams crisscrossing the country, to your point, racking up some of those frequent flyer miles that can make life difficult, especially when you start to deal with the elements, unfamiliar territory deeper into the season when that wear and tear gets to be even more difficult to try and quantify. Wear and tear shouldn't be a major issue, though, in the final game that we'll preview on today's show. That, of course, takes place in Baton Rouge, where Alabama and LSU will renew acquaintances. Alabama, a full field goal favorite on the road for their trip to Tiger Stadium. Total in this game at 58.5. Alabama, they lead the all-time series 56-27-5. These programs meeting as top 15 opponents for the 15th time in the last 18 meetings for the third straight season. 3 of the last 5 meetings between them have been decided by 6 points or less. Alabama, they finished with 2 losses or fewer in 13 straight seasons. It's the third longest streak in the AP poll era. 14 each by the 1936 to 1949 Notre Dame Fighting Irish that I'm sure Brad remembers well as the 1987 to 2000 Florida State Seminoles that Payne remembers the glory days of Bobby Bowden and company. Alabama playing their third straight game versus ranked opponents, lost to Tennessee, beat number 21 Missouri at home, a banged-up Missouri team at that. The last 4 Alabama head coaches, they've all lost their first game against LSU. It doesn't matter if your name is Mike Dubois, Dennis Franchione, Mike Shula, or the GOAT Nick Saban. The last Alabama head coach to win his first game versus LSU was Gene Stallings all the way back in 1990. And you can make the case that Kalen DeBoer needs this game like blood against an LSU team that is still trying to keep their playoff hopes alive. LSU fresh off of blowing a double-digit halftime lead against Texas A&M, but they do have 14 straight home wins. And you look at this LSU team, they have been outstanding as a home underdog. 6-2 straight up the last 8 times they've caught points in their own building, compiling a 6-1-1 ATS result. Brad, Alabama's offense, they haven't shown that big play potential as consistently as we saw from Kalen DeBoer and his Washington team last year, but it doesn't mean that Jalen Milroe isn't a home run waiting to happen as a runner or a thrower. The backfield, it's been left a little bit to be desired, but Jam Miller has asserted himself as a true number one. Jeremy Bernard and Ryan Williams providing a nice 1-2 punch in the passing attack against an LSU defense that's trended up. But the real question remains, who gets the edge with some extra time to prepare for what should be a fascinating chess match on this side of the ball?
Yeah, I agree. It is going to be a chess match because we'll see if the extra bye week allows LSU enough time to come up with a game plan to stop a running quarterback, because obviously Brian Kelly mentioned it in the post game of the Texas A&M game. The way you beat this LSU defense is with a mobile quarterback, and last I checked, Jalen Milroe is pretty mobile. And speaking of his mobility hurting an LSU defense, certainly did last year because he ran for 155 yards against this LSU defense. So we'll see if they can make the proper adjustments. I would say this, it would be concerning to me on LSU's defense that they weren't ready for A&M's quarterback when the fact of the matter was Reed had played more snaps than Connor Wigman coming into the game, so certainly concerning. With that being said, I mean, there's opportunities for both teams to take advantage of opposing. There's a reason why both teams have 2 losses. They're not completely buttoned up on either side of the ball, and there's some opportunities here to take advantage of some weaknesses. Let's start with Alabama's side of it. Besides the quarterback run game that could take advantage of LSU's defense, obviously, you mentioned some big plays in the passing game. Jam Miller's also been more consistent at running back. I will say this, though, as far as the big plays, I mean, for a good portion of this season, and we've said this even the last couple of seasons, Milroe throws the deep balls as well as anybody in college football. And for the first half of the season, Ryan Williams was the best deep play threat, I would say, at the wide receiver position in college football. I remember previewing prior to the Tennessee game, he was number 1 in the country in yards per catch. What's happened, though, since then? Last 3 games, 16 catches, so he's still getting targeted. He's still, being productive. Only 158 yards, less than 10 yards per catch when he had been averaging 25 yards per catch. Certainly teams are starting to bracket him, give him a little bit more focus, and they're pretty much trying to take the deep shot to Ryan Williams away from this Alabama offense. Obviously, it's still a concern. Feels like it's a broken record. Can Alabama's offensive line protect? Because there's still some issues here as far as their offensive line. Better than last year, but not saying much. And certainly as the competition's gotten a little bit stronger in SEC play, they've given up 9 sacks the last 3 games. And on the other side, LSU's defense, if there's one thing they do really well, it's getting after the quarterback, particularly as of late. 26 sacks in the last 6 games. Obviously got Swinson with 8 sacks. Savion Jones on the other side. I think that the defense is pretty, stabilized for the most part with the more snaps by Whit Weeks. Zy Alexander's played really well at cornerback. 18 targets, only 32 yards allowed so far this season. With that being said, LSU's defense prone to the quarterback run game. Defensive success rate still pretty average, 68th in the country. They're better than last year, but this is still an LSU defense that ranks 81st in yards per play allowed, 58th in yards per game. So, yeah, they're better than last year, but again, that was an historically bad LSU defense, and there's still plenty of opportunities for Alabama to take advantage of them here. So I don't see a huge edge either way. I think, obviously good, I'll say good Alabama offense probably beats average LSU defense, so slight edge here to Alabama.
You mentioned, Brad, I think astutely, the changing of the guard. Not necessarily, maybe that's too strong a sentiment in terms of the Alabama pass game. Ryan Williams, number 3 in the SEC in receiving yards, but 4 straight games with 82 or less receiving yards. Meanwhile, Jeremy Bernard has kind of taken off a little bit. 4 straight games for him of 70-plus as teams look to key in on Williams and take away the true big play explosive threat. Payne, LSU offensively, look, they left a lot to be desired in their performance in College Station against Texas A&M the last time we saw them. Garrett Nussmeier, 25 of 50, 400-plus yards passing, 2 touchdowns, but a career-high 3 interceptions, all coming in the second half. Since 2000, he became the 3rd LSU quarterback to throw for 400-plus yards in a loss, joining Jaden Daniels and everybody's favorite Tigers quarterback, Miles Brennan. Nussmeier, as far as his numbers, Delta is with pressure. 19 of his 20 touchdown passes have come when kept clean. That may get to be a little bit more difficult with the LSU offensive line dinged up. Alabama defensively hasn't been great this season, but they have shown flashes and ability to get after the quarterback. LSU and their kind of lopsided emphasis on the passing game more so than creating balance against an Alabama defense that's been good in the first half of each of their last 2 games, but we've also seen some vulnerabilities in spots for Crimson Tide when it comes to consistency.
I think it'd help if LSU can find its run game, right? And that's the balance they're attempting. Yeah, but they're attempting it, right? Couldn't against A&M, to your point. Caden Durham, 14 yards on 12 carries. Couldn't against Ole Miss, 37 yards on 12 carries. Coming out of the bye week, Joe Sloan has to figure out how to create some balance, how to be multiple. Brian Kelly's talked about that multiple times leading up to this game, about creating more uncertainty in terms of what LSU's doing on offense. Screen game. Misdirection, obviously improving the run game, and just kind of creating multiple points of preparation for an opponent. Because to your point, it's just been a drop-back pass game where Nussmeier really isn't a threat to run, and I think this is something that we've anticipated and expected, right? When you go from a zone read run game with Jaden Daniels, you're going to have to go back to a traditional run game, and it's going to look a little bit different. That was the reason why we went under 9.5 wins. Probably should have already cashed that ticket, but here we are. Hopefully, we get a Bama win by like 1-3 this week. That would be the perfect scenario, because a lot of it is being asked of Garrett Nussmeier right now. The pass rate over expectation continues to tick up for LSU's offense. Now, I would think the minute Kane Womack throws on the tape, he's going to formulate a game plan that attacks the right side of LSU's offensive line. It's been a problem. Although you just look in totality on the season, Nuss has only been pressured on 24% of dropbacks. and pressure and making Nuss uncomfortable is kind of the key here. The problem is Alabama could not get pressure against Wisconsin's offensive line, 21% pressure rate. And I know they won that game, but I look at some of the underlying things that maybe a little bit of a factor later on when the games get a little bit tougher. There really wasn't a repercussion for that against Wisconsin when a backup quarterback gets inserted on the fly and there's not a legitimate passing threat. Could not get pressure against Georgia. Carson Beck was only pressured on actually less than 21% of his dropbacks. Alabama created below average pressure rates against both Vanderbilt and Tennessee. It's a Bama defensive front that's outside the top 40 in a lot of key schedule adjusted metrics, and that would have to change this week, especially if you want to attack maybe other areas of this offensive line there, Todd, for LSU. We saw left guard Garrett Dellinger out with an ankle injury, had the tightrope surgery. He's going to miss some time. Alabama, though, has not faced a good schedule of passing offenses. I think we've talked about that a few times in some of our big game breakdowns for the Tide, and they're still outside our top 50 in both EPA per pass surrendered and explosive pass rate allowed. LSU seems to be getting some weapons back. We saw Chris Hilton return a little bit, had a couple catches, potentially the return of C.J. Daniels as well. So if you can protect Garrett Nussmeier, I think he's going to find some success in this game to where maybe you don't need to fire up the ground game as much as we think or as much as Brian Kelly's hoping for. To this point, it's been an Alabama defense that's lived off turnovers as well. 18 interceptions or fumble recoveries in 8 games. So I think LSU finds success through the air. And if they get their run game going just enough, I think it helps in a big way in this matchup.
Last thing, guys, we talked about the coaching matchup earlier in the Georgia-Ole Miss game with Lane Kiffin on one side and Kirby Smart on the other. I'll open it up to either of you guys. When we try and assess where Kalen DeBoer is so far with a limited sample size as bench boss at Alabama versus Brian Kelly, do you guys give either one of these gentlemen a nod, either a decided advantage, or do we call it a wash in terms of trying to figure out how to quantify the intangibles?
I think we've spoke extremely high of Kalen DeBoer the last couple of years. There's no doubt about that. Probably, I mean, as we look back, there was a lot of talent on that Washington offense. Now that we have a chance to digest that. This kind of feels like in his new environment at Alabama, this is a big game for both of these coaches.
Oh, my God.
Right?
Well,
right?
losers
That's
out.
a big game for both of them.
Well, but think about maybe some long-term stuff, right? I mean, there are some Alabama fans that are just so stuck in the Saban era thinking that was ever going to be replicated again, and hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Kalen DeBoer is able to do that once he gets a few recruiting classes in there, and we do think the offense is going to trend up, right? That's the reality of this. But massive game for Brian Kelly. Not just this game, but like what's going on behind the scenes in the recruiting vibe right now with his quarterback, right? So I think this game has a ton of implication in terms of where these two head coaches potentially trend. It might be more meaningful than just the game played Saturday night.
I'll tell you one thing. If I'm Bryce Underwood, I don't care how much you're offering me to go lead the Michigan offense or I can play at LSU and have a path to the NFL. It's a no-brainer for me. But then again, I'm not in that spot, and no one is offering me that kind of money to go out there and play quarterback at the college level.
No shit, I've seen you throw.
Yep, it's a noodle arm. There's a reason I played second base, my friend. I ain't going to make anybody forget.
Chuck Knobloch we got hosting this podcast.
Nah, Chuck Knobloch, I'm a little bit more accurate, just a lot less zip. But yep, not known for the arm strength, not going to be out there in any turkey bowl anytime soon, trying to stretch the defense, throwing against the cover 2 or cover 3.
A lot of reps, sidearm to the dog there, the dog toss.
Yeah, this dog's a lot faster. I mean, I had a fullback previously. Now I got a wide receiver. Going to tire me out some. You can follow Payne on social media at Payne Insider. You can follow Brad there as well at Brad Power 7. I'm Todd Fuhrman. Most importantly, for all things podcast related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And gentlemen, best bet portion of the program. Brad, we know you gave your non-Powers 5 a little bit earlier, and I think all of us were in agreement there. Payne, what are we doing as far as the big boys are concerned this Saturday in college football?
I'm just going to deliver it, and I'm going to have you lay it out. 1-2-7, West Virginia, plus the 5.
Mountaineers, fresh off a bye, a little change at quarterback. I don't think there is a downgrade from Garrett Green to Nico, and I'm going to butcher his last name, so I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. Marquiel. Okay, there we go, Brad. I appreciate that. And
State
this
guy.
is a West Virginia team that should have a decided edge in their ability to run the football against this Cincinnati defensive front. You look at some of the underlying metrics for Cincinnati. They're not great against the run. They're a little bit better against the pass, but if West Virginia, especially as a 5-point underdog, can dictate pace and tempo, open some things up in the throwing game, I think it provides a tremendous path for Neil Brown and company to go out there and get the win. But maybe more importantly, at least for me in the handicap of this game, West Virginia on the defensive side, their Achilles heel all season has been their inability to defend the pass. And you go through some of the opponents they've played, they've been very prone to the explosive play against. Fortunately for them, Brandon Sorsby is a good quarterback for Cincinnati, but the Bearcats aren't a team that lives and breathes with the explosives. When you dig into some of their numbers, nothing to write home about in that particular regard. It's a lot more dink and dunk, methodical, trying to move the ball down the field one play at a time. And I think that from a backup quarterback standpoint, Market's moved a little bit too far. And I'll echo some of Brad's sentiments. Do I know if this is the best number in the market as we sit in no man's land at 5? No, I don't. Hopefully, there is a chance that maybe you're able to get a 6 if you wait it out. But for me, this is a nice buy point for West Virginia, who I actually give the edge in the coaching box as well in this particular spot. So West Virginia plus the 5. What's up, Payne?
Yeah, I think to your point, just to reiterate some of the rush advantages West Virginia may show here, we have Cincinnati right now at this point outside our top 110 in rushing success rate allowed. EPA per rush allowed. They give up some explosives, so you have a nice running dog here in West Virginia.
It is always a blueprint for success. BP, anything you'd like to add? Do we get the power stamp of approval on where we're going in the Big 12 this week? A league known for its unpredictable nature so far this season.
I've been doing West Virginia local radio with guys that do play-by-play for a decade. So you're going to get agreement in that the downgrade of the backup isn't that significant, particularly this year. Green's been incredibly disappointing. It even goes back to the opener. He was not, for whatever reason, on a consistent down and down out basis in their zone read scheme, was not making the right reads, whether to give it to the back or keep it consistently all season. He wasn't doing it. So they got a little bit of a fresh start in the Arizona game. Arizona stinks, but West Virginia, the market bet against them, and obviously they were clearly the right side in that game, even actually led it by more than the final. So, agreement here. Only made it 3.
Let's get there with the Mountaineers. Let's get there with the Mean Green. Put together a nice, tidy 2-0 and continue to build on what we put forth last week for Bet the Board as a collective 4-1 across the board with props, college football, and everything else we've offered up. West Virginia, a couple of chances to get themselves bowl eligible as they sit here at 4-4 against Cincinnati team, a little bit overvalued. Gentlemen, anything else you'd like to share? Any other nuggets for some of the games that we haven't covered this weekend? Should be fun in the SEC to see these teams knock each other around a little bit and help that college football playoff picture take a little bit more shape.
Got nothing.
All right. It's official. We'll close the book on this one. I want to wish all of you, our loyal listeners, the best of luck with all of your investments for college football week 11. Most importantly, with a North Texas and West Virginia ticket in that old portfolio, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.